More than 1,200 tanks have been destroyed, abandoned, or captured in less than 3 years of fighting. This is not a statistic from a forgotten war in black and white footage. This is happening now in Ukraine, where Leopard 2, M1A1 Abrams, and Challenger 2 tanks, once seen as the backbone of NATO ground power, are being forced to fight in ways their designers never planned. On a battlefield covered by drones, every movement can be detected in seconds, sometimes faster than a crew can react. What was once a symbol of breakthrough and speed is now a visible target in the sky. In this environment, tanks no longer charge forward to punch holes through defensive lines. They hide, wait, and survive, or they do not last long. This shift carries serious consequences far beyond Ukraine. If tanks can no longer perform their traditional role under constant surveillance, then decades of Western armored doctrine face a hard test. Ukraine is not simply losing equipment and adjusting tactics. It is quietly redefining what armored warfare looks like when cheap drones hunt machines worth millions. Some tanks are no longer leading attacks but drawing fire. Others appear briefly from cover, strike, and disappear before artillery can respond. These changes are not theoretical debates in military schools. So what exactly is happening on the ground? And why are Western militaries paying such close attention to how Ukraine is fighting this war? When Western tanks first arrived, the battlefield logic looked clear and familiar, because Ukraine applied the NATO armored doctrine that had shaped training and planning for decades. The plan placed tanks at the front, with mechanized infantry moving behind them, and the goal was to break through Russian defensive lines before pushing deeper into contested territory. This approach assumed that speed, armor, and firepower could overwhelm resistance before the defender had time to react. Once these formations began moving, that assumption collapsed almost immediately. UAVs were already in the air, watching approach routes long before engines crossed the line of contact, and every vehicle left a visible signature from above that could not be erased by camouflage alone. As columns advanced, mines slowed movement, forced detours, and broke formation, which created pauses that became fatal rather than temporary. Those pauses gave Russian artillery crews enough time to receive coordinates and adjust fire, turning what was meant to be a fast push into a stalled and exposed target area. The first impacts did not only damage vehicles because they disrupted rhythm and command flow at the same time. Tank crews began to realize that moving forward was no longer a simple action, since each kilometer added risk instead of momentum. When one vehicle stopped, others could not simply bypass it, because mines and observation forced the entire group into predictable paths. From the ground, these movements felt cautious and controlled, but from the air they appeared slow and obvious. UAV operators tracked columns as they spread out, paused, and tried to regroup, and that tracking turned into fire missions within minutes. The doctrine expected tanks to shape the battlefield, yet the battlefield shaped the tanks instead. Infantry units following behind faced the same problem, because once the lead elements were fixed in place, the rear could not maneuver freely without drawing attention. What had been designed as combined arms teamwork began to break into isolated actions, with each unit reacting to pressure rather than executing a plan. Crews noticed that survival depended less on armor thickness and more on whether movement could stay hidden long enough to avoid detection. This was not a slow lesson learned over months. It became clear within days that the environment itself punished the core idea of armored breakthrough. Every step forward created data for the Russian, and that data traveled faster than any vehicle on the ground. The logic that tanks could absorb punishment while advancing did not hold once strikes came from multiple directions at the same time. Top-down attacks, indirect fire, and precision strikes turned even brief exposure into unacceptable risk. As losses mounted, commanders faced a choice that doctrine did not prepare them for. Continuing to push meant repeating the same pattern with the same outcome, while stopping meant abandoning the role tanks were meant to play. This moment forced a pause not only in movement but in thinking. The battlefield had revealed a gap between theory and reality that could not be ignored. If armored units could no longer advance under constant observation, then the traditional role of tanks had reached a limit in this kind of war. Rabatino became the moment when Ukraine was forced to stop and reassess, because the summer offensive revealed limits that training had not prepared crews to face. As armored units moved toward the settlement, Leopard 2 and Challenger 2 tanks advanced according to NATO manuals, with confidence that protection and coordination would allow them to push through prepared defenses. The terrain quickly challenged that belief, since open approaches narrowed into mined corridors that slowed movement and compressed vehicles into predictable paths. Once the first tanks entered these routes, observation from the air turned steady movement into a visible sequence that could be followed without interruption. UAVs tracked the columns as they progressed, while attack helicopters and anti-tank teams waited for moments when speed dropped and spacing tightened. The first strikes did not destroy entire formations at once, but they broke momentum by forcing halts, reversals, and emergency maneuvers under pressure. Each stop created a new problem, because recovery vehicles could not move freely, and infantry could not spread out without exposing themselves. As losses appeared, crews realized that the threat did not come from a single direction, since missiles arrived from long range while loitering drones circled above, marking positions for follow-on fire. The battle did not unfold as a clean clash of armor, but as a sequence of interruptions that drained initiative step by step. Tank commanders faced a shrinking set of options because pushing forward increased exposure while pulling back left damaged vehicles behind. Communication became harder as units reacted to contact rather than following a planned rhythm, and coordination between armor and infantry weakened under stress. What stood out was not a failure of machines, since the tanks absorbed hits and protected crews in ways older designs could not. The problem lay in how those machines were committed, because they were asked to perform a role that no longer matched the conditions on the ground. Rabatino showed that advancing first no longer meant shaping the fight, since the defender controlled timing through observation and precision strikes. As the engagement continued, the cost of repeating the same approach became clear, because each renewed push followed a pattern the enemy had already learned to exploit. This forced Ukrainian commanders to pause operations and reconsider how armor should be used when every move was visible. The decision that followed was not dramatic, but it was decisive. Tanks would no longer act as spearheads meant to break lines through force alone. Instead, survival became the priority, and concealment replaced speed as the key factor in planning. Units began to pull armor back from exposed roles and look for ways to fight without drawing immediate attention. Camouflage, covered positions, and selective engagement took precedence over continuous advance. The lesson from Rabatino was direct and difficult, because it demanded abandoning a doctrine that had defined armored warfare for generations. This was not a retreat from using tanks, but a retreat from using them in predictable ways. The battlefield had made its argument through action, and ignoring it meant repeating losses without gaining ground. The role of the M1A1 Abrams changed once Ukrainian commanders accepted that leading an attack was no longer its most useful function. Instead of charging forward to break a line, Abrams units began moving with strict control, advancing just far enough to draw attention without committing to a full push. This movement was deliberate and measured, because the goal was not speed, but reaction. As the tank appeared on open ground, UAVs quickly focused on it, and that attention pulled eyes, missiles, and artillery toward a single point. The Abrams became a visible problem that Russian forces felt pressure to solve. Anti-tank teams prepared shots, loitering drones adjusted their approach, and artillery crews began lining up coordinates. While this focus built, something else happened behind the tank. BMPs and infantry units used the moment to shift positions, cross exposed ground, and approach objectives that would have been too dangerous minutes earlier. The Abrams absorbed attention that would otherwise have fallen on lighter vehicles and dismounted troops. This sequence repeated across several engagements, and it reshaped how the battlefield was managed in real time. The tank was no longer shaping the fight through forward momentum, but through controlled exposure. Hits did occur, and some were severe, yet the design of the Abrams played a quiet role in why this tactic could work. Crew compartments remained intact even after multiple impacts, allowing crews to evacuate or continue operating when other vehicles would have been lost outright. That survivability changed how commanders calculated risk, because losing a vehicle did not always mean losing the people inside it. As strikes landed, Russian firing points revealed themselves through launch flashes, drone movement, and radio traffic. Once those positions were identified, Ukrainian units could respond with precision, using artillery or drones to neutralize threats that had exposed themselves. The Abrams did not need to destroy these positions directly. It only needed to stay present long enough for the enemy to react. This was a reversal of expectations, because tanks had traditionally been the instruments that delivered decisive blows. Here, the decisive effect came from forcing the opponent to act. On the ground, crews understood that their role had shifted, and this awareness shaped how they handled their machines. Movements were short, angles were chosen carefully, and withdrawal routes were planned before advancing. When the tank pulled back, it did so before fire could concentrate, leaving behind a changed situation rather than a cratered hull. This method demanded discipline because patience replaced aggression as the main skill. The Abrams had become a tool to control tempo, not to chase breakthroughs. Infantry units working behind this shield reported fewer sudden strikes during movement because enemy systems were already engaged elsewhere. This did not make the battlefield safe, but it reduced uncertainty during the most dangerous moments. The tank took on punishment so others could move. That trade was intentional. Critics might call this wasteful, since a costly platform was being used as bait. From the perspective of those operating under constant surveillance, the calculation looked different. If exposure was unavoidable, then choosing what to expose became a form of control. The Abrams offered a surface that could survive contact long enough to matter. Over time, this approach settled into routine, and it no longer looked like improvisation. It became a pattern that units trained for and expected. The tank advanced, attention followed, space opened, and infantry moved. This cycle repeated without the dramatic charges once associated with armored warfare. The Abrams was no longer the spear. It was the shield that made movement possible. Whether this represents waste or necessity depends on how modern battlefields are understood. In an environment where being seen invites attack, drawing fire can be more valuable than avoiding it. That reality has reshaped the meaning of armor, and it has placed the Abrams in a role few designers ever imagined. Leopard 2 and Challenger 2 units began to fight in a very different way once direct advances proved too costly, because survival depended on remaining unseen longer than the enemy could react. For Leopard 2 crews, the battlefield became a place of waiting rather than movement, with tanks hidden inside damaged buildings, warehouses, or reinforced positions that blended into the terrain. These locations were chosen carefully, since overhead cover and broken outlines reduced the chance of fast detection from the air. The tank stayed silent while thermal sights tracked activity along roads and open ground, watching for moments when enemy vehicles moved without full protection. When that moment arrived, the Leopard appeared briefly, often for no more than a minute, delivered accurate fire against command vehicles or armored escorts, and then pulled back into concealment. This short exposure window limited the time available for artillery response, which was often delayed by uncertainty about the firing position. The engagement felt sudden to the target because the tank was not present long enough to shape expectations. Once the Leopard disappeared, the area returned to silence, leaving behind damaged equipment and confusion rather than a clear frontline clash. This method demanded patience because crews had to resist the urge to pursue or stay engaged once a hit was achieved. Remaining in place meant inviting attention, and attention in this environment carried immediate risk. Challenger 2 units followed a similar logic, but applied it at greater distance, since their strength lay in precision rather than maneuver. The rifled gun allowed accurate fire at long range, which fit well with a role that emphasized distance and cover. Instead of moving with infantry columns, Challenger 2 crews operated from prepared positions where observation was strong and withdrawal routes were clear. Targets were selected carefully, often focusing on vehicles supporting an advance rather than the leading elements themselves. A single accurate strike could halt movement, forcing enemy units to pause and reorganize. Once that pause occurred, the Challenger withdrew before drones could narrow down the firing location. This pattern turned the tank into a heavy sniper rather than a mobile assault platform. Speed mattered less than timing, and movement was limited to moments when it reduced exposure rather than increased it. Both tanks shared a common rule that shaped every action, which was to avoid direct confrontation whenever possible. There was no attempt to trade fire or hold ground under pressure. The goal was to influence the battle without becoming fixed inside it. UAV presence made lingering dangerous, since even a successful engagement could become a loss if attention remained focused. By appearing briefly and disappearing quickly, these tanks denied the enemy the chance to settle into a response. This approach also changed how supporting units operated, because infantry and drones could exploit the disruption created by sudden strikes. Enemy formations slowed down, routes were reconsidered, and movement became cautious. The tank did not need to advance to create this effect. It only needed to break certainty. Crews adjusted their mindset as well, since restraint replaced aggression as the mark of success. Over time, this method became routine rather than exceptional. Leopard 2 and Challenger 2 crews planned engagements around time limits, escape paths, and silence. Every action began with the question of how quickly attention would follow. This reality pushed speed into a new meaning. It was no longer about how fast a tank could move across ground. It was about how quickly it could act and then disappear. The engagement near Kupiansk showed how a modern armored action can unfold without any attempt at a classic breakthrough, because the goal was to disrupt timing rather than seize ground by force. Ukrainian planners prepared the area days in advance, selecting abandoned structures along a key route that Russian vehicles had been using to rotate units and move supplies. A Leopard 2 was moved into one of these buildings under cover of darkness, with its outline broken by walls and debris that blended into the surrounding damage. From that position, the crew did not search for targets aggressively, because the task was to wait and observe while drones and forward observers tracked movement along the road. When a Russian column began moving through the area, it followed a familiar pattern, with command vehicles and support elements traveling close together to maintain control. The Leopard remained concealed at the forest edge as the column entered the chosen zone, allowing the vehicles to commit fully before any sign of contact appeared. This patience mattered, because early fire would have allowed the column to halt and scatter before pressure could build. Once the lead elements passed the key reference points, the tank moved forward just enough to gain a clear firing angle. The first shots targeted command vehicles and support platforms rather than the heaviest armor, because removing coordination mattered more than destroying mass. Within seconds, the column lost its rhythm as vehicles braked, reversed, or tried to reposition without clear direction. The Leopard did not stay to observe the effect, because the crew knew that drones would already be adjusting their view. After the final round, the tank withdrew back into cover, using a pre-planned route that avoided open ground and reduced the chance of tracking. Artillery response followed shortly after, but it landed on positions that were already empty. The damage had been done before counterfire could matter. Without clear leadership and with support vehicles disabled, the remaining Russian elements hesitated. Movement slowed, spacing widened, and units focused on security rather than advance. This pause created the real opportunity. Ukrainian infantry units that had been waiting nearby began to move, using the confusion to cross exposed terrain that would normally be too dangerous. Drones shifted attention from the tank to the stalled column, guiding infantry around damaged vehicles and toward higher ground overlooking the route. The Leopard did not reappear because its role in this phase was complete. The fight moved on without it. From the outside, this action did not look dramatic because there was no sweeping advance or visible collapse. What changed was tempo. A route that had supported steady movement became uncertain, forcing Russian units to adjust plans and slow operations in the area. That disruption carried effects beyond the immediate engagement, since caution replaced routine along nearby roads. This kind of attack relied on coordination rather than mass. The tank acted as a trigger rather than a hammer. It appeared, struck, and vanished, leaving other elements to exploit the result. At no point did the Leopard attempt to hold ground or press forward. By breaking the enemy's rhythm, the tank changed decisions on the ground. That balance defined the action, and it revealed how armored warfare is being practiced under constant observation. Rather than pushing lines forward, the tank bent the fight just enough for others to move. That shift in role marked a clear departure from older expectations, and it illustrated how a single, well-timed appearance can alter an entire engagement. What is unfolding in Ukraine shows that tanks are not disappearing from modern war. What is disappearing is the old certainty about how they should be used. Under constant drone surveillance, rapid artillery response, and real-time targeting, armored vehicles are no longer pushing forward as steel spears meant to break lines by force. They are pulling fire, setting traps, breaking enemy rhythm, and creating narrow windows for infantry to move. Abrams tanks draw attention so others can advance. Leopard 2 units strike briefly and vanish before counterfire can lock on. Challenger 2 platforms deliver precise long-range hits and leave before the sky turns hostile. Together, these actions point to a battlefield where survival matters more than speed and timing matters more than mass. This shift raises a larger question that goes far beyond Ukraine. Is this only a temporary adaptation to a unique war, or is it the early shape of how ground combat will look for years to come? If drones continue to control the sky, will future tanks be designed to hide rather than rush? Will armies invest more in deception, coordination, and disruption instead of breakthrough power? If this analysis helped clarify how modern armored warfare is changing, support the channel by hitting like, sharing the video, and subscribing to Military Force. Join the discussion in the comments and share what this shift means for the future of war.